aerobic training is probably reasonably well misunderstood, to be perfectly honest with you. We typically, with aerobic training, are thinking about notions of continuous. In fact, both of the methods I'm going to talk to you about here are both continuous training methods. And I just want you to sort of think about the notion of continuous and, loosely speaking, what we call intermittent or interval training. They're different in their nature and they contain different forms of training in them. So for example, today we're going to look at the purity of continuous training itself, and we're going to look at fartlek. But in both cases, neither of them have any breaks or rest periods. They have lower intensity if it's fartlek and higher intensity if it's fartlek, but they don't stop. The athletes don't stop. Whereas intermittent, which could mean circuit training, it could mean interval training, it could mean HIIT, it could mean resistance training, it could mean plyometrics training. These types of training are defined by having breaks for recovery, and focus on the word breaks. So we're here in this tutorial, continuous. So let's take continuous itself, which is its very own training method with its own sort of distinct name. We're going to talk about continuous here. I've got a couple of images, one urban, one sort of more rural, to represent this idea. And the main points I want to get across to you are that this is a steady state form of exercise. Now remind yourself what steady state means. It means that at all points after the initial few minutes of let's say the run or the cycle or swim, the circulatory, respiratory and vascular systems are able to supply enough oxygen to meet the oxygen demand. So that means if we were to draw roughly kind of an oxygen consumption graph, it would go like this. It would plateau and then we get recovery at the end. That's what we mean by steady state. We're not getting this up and down, up and down, up and down. That's what we mean. Oxygen supply is meeting oxygen demand. Now, other things. We must have a training episode as greater than 20 minutes. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. One is that this is a relatively long duration type experience. So, of course, it's going to be more than 20 minutes. But the other point is that this figure is important because this is roughly how long it takes the average person to start metabolizing fat as a fuel source for the aerobic energy system, okay? So this 20 minutes is a really, really significant detail, actually. The other thing to say is that the training, and I've been here numerous times in my life, it can be up to 2 hours and longer if people have refueling strategies. Now this figure is important as well because 2 hours on average is the extent of the body's glycogen stores in the liver and the muscle. So the 2 hours represents effectively the glycogen that we've got in our body able to power aerobic respiration. And then finally, before we look at the strengths and weaknesses of this system, we will typically work at 60 to 80% of max HR. Now, again, I feel a bit bad giving this figure because really good quality athletes will often work at above 80% of heart rate max, actually. But our typical figures that we would give are 60 to 80% of max heart rate. Of course, we would use the simple Carvone principle to calculate max heart rate. You can use 220 minus age, for example. And then, of course, we'd work those percentages out. Now, strengths. What are the advantages of this method? Well, first of all, it's super simple. And we could also say it's available to all people, whatever your state of conditioning, whatever your state of mobility, you can basically, in the main, go out your front door and do this thing. Okay, now that doesn't apply to every single person, but give or take, it's also what we could describe as quite cheap. Now trainers are not always cheap, but going running doesn't necessarily involve really expensive trainers. The other thing that this is really good for is it's obviously really good for aerobic performance. So that's the main strength. Now, can I stress again? I've given examples of running here, but there's no reason why this couldn't be cycling. There's no reason why this couldn't be walking. There's no reason why this couldn't be swimming, rowing. These are all kayaking, potential examples of doing continuous training. Now, there are negatives. The first one is that many people find it to be tedious, dull, repetitive, boring. Use any of those words. You may be one of those individuals. Secondly, it takes a long time. I mean, running is one thing, but take something like road cycling. Not only do you have to go out for a good couple of hours on your bike potentially, but you've got to get all your kit on, you've got to get all that stuff, you've got to get your bag ready, you've got to pump your wheels up, tyres even, and so on and so on. So it can get really quite laborious. Thirdly, lots of research says that continuous training over time reduces speed. So if you are a games player, for example, if you're a midfielder in hockey, and yes, you need to be aerobically sort of dynamic, but you also need to be dynamic in terms of speed and strength and forcefulness, then this might not be the method for you because the research suggests it does actually reduce pure speed in people. And finally, we'll talk about this potentially in other areas of our courses, but it can cause chronic injuries. Think about things like stress fractures. Think about things like ITBS, iliotibial band syndrome. That's a classic runner's injury of the knee and the upper leg, where you get a lot of soreness from tendons and fascia tissue rubbing against bone and continue. These kind of injuries are quite common because, of course, joints are repeatedly moving. Now, we also today want to have a look at fartlek training. Now, can I repeat again? Fartlek training absolutely is a form of continuous training. Let's be absolutely clear about that. But there are differences here. So first of all, let me say it's continuous. Let's make that absolutely clear. And the reason it's continuous, folks, is because there are no breaks. Yes, there are changes of intensity, changes of speed, but there are no stops. Now, I've sort of shown here what kind of this thing is, because we have got here varying in these images. If you look at these, you've got varying intensity. Now, that is shown in the first image on the left, presumably because this person is legging up this hill. Secondly, you've got varying incline. I mean, literally there, this person's running uphill. It's an incline. And thirdly, we might have varying terrain, okay? And you see this person is not running on concrete, they're running on some kind of lakeside path, and how beautiful it is. I wish my runs looked like this. They really, really don't. Sometimes the gym equipment I use, treadmills, static bikes, that kind of stuff, tries to replicate these sort of journeys, but it's never the same, let's be honest. And this is really good, this fartlek stuff for games players, because it is more dynamic, because it does have more speed involved. Now, we're only going to look at strengths here. First of all, it's more varied. And we're saying more varied than continuous, of course. So the fact that this can be, for example, involving sprints, walks, jogs, the fact that this can be off-road, the fact that you can get into the countryside, the fact that you can do this on a beach, on sand, this makes it a more varied experience than pure continuous. And the other major point with fartlek training is one of the weaknesses of pure continuous training, and it's that this one maintains speed, or it's capable of maintaining speed. So if we go back to our continuous training, which we said, of course, it reduces speed potentially, well, fartlek is an option. Even if it's a combination training, fartlek's an option because it can maintain speed. Why? Because it involves things like sprint episodes. Okay, so we can include things like sprint episodes and do in fartlek training bluntly. So, two types of aerobic training there. Do look out for other tutorials, depending on the course you're on, by the way, but do look out for other tutorials. For example, HIIT training, high intensity interval training, which has a strong impact on the aerobic systems. But these two I wanted to cover in this particular tutorial. Thanks.